At midnight on October the 4th, as the largest ever invasion in all of human history had commenced, with the tandem anti satellite and cyber strikes, along with the local usage in various battle spaces across the nation of very potent electronic warfare jamming technologies in the form of air, land, or even in some cases along the coast, sea based systems. The mass of coalition forces in two different components, one being the Trojan shock armies, which originated on CCP regime properties strategically purchased throughout the nation, as the other component, which were the external invasion forces acting as their heavy-handed reinforcements originating in both Mexico and Canada, as well as off the coast, were to move rapidly inland without stopping until they reached their final destinations, whereupon they would shed off and spread out their various forces to act as the heavy handed reinforcements for the Trojans already deep inland doing the heavy lifting. These forces rapidly smashing their way into the nation at midnight were now racing up their designated key invasion routes to make their way deep into the heart of the land, where they would again spread out and aid the Trojans already now breaking out of their CCP regime properties nationwide and going for the proverbial jugular of the nation, as most of the external invasion prongs at this time were battering and destroying initial resistance along the borders. There was one invasion prong in particular of external forces which essentially would see no resistance whatsoever at all, as they were smashing their way across a sector of border which was undefended. This was the external invasion prong of PLA Group Armies 1 through 6 and the 41st Russian Combined Arms Army with them. This very massive external invasion prong, which again included the 41st Russian Combined Arms Army, including with a very small contingent of VVS or Russian Air Force Mi-35 attack helo gunships, which would scout the way ahead, along with PLA Z-10 attack helo gunships from the 6th PLA Group Army. These massive and very powerful external invasion forces moving inland from their positions in Mexico essentially would move along state highways through much of the duration of their penetration into the country, as the Russian and Chinese forces would race towards Big Spring, Texas, where they would meet a very tiny company-sized element of Chinese national militia forces who were manning a CCP regime property with gargantuan fuel tanks and barns full of supplies, as it would be a self-service logistical resupply center for the most part. These PLA Group armies, with tens of millions of gallons of fuel at their disposal, would refuel their vehicles, as all of the Chinese and Russian vehicles at a bare minimum had a maximum range on roads of at least 280 miles or more in many cases, as the CCP regime property whereupon they were racing towards their supply dump was essentially 270 miles inland from where they would make their border penetration, as they would be moving up the state highways of State Highway 90 and then State Highway 163 to State Highway 87 before reaching Big Spring in approximately 8 hours, where they would stop for approximately 4 hours to resupply all of their equipment. As the cover provided by the emerging coalition air power already penetrating American airspace before the first vehicles had even crossed, the ability of the coalition air power to achieve air superiority would occur in very short order, allowing for the external invasion forces and the Trojan shock army components inland to initiate operations immediately and without any interference from the skies, as there would only, within the south central invasion sector in particular, be one air battle which would occur, as coalition air power was already by now hundreds of miles inland with their beyond visual range capabilities, as they would even be aided by AWACS aircraft, such as, in this particular area, a Chinese KJ-2000 AWACS aircraft, which would circle the Midland-Odessa area, being protected in particular by Iranian F-14s of a contributed F-14 squadron, as well as the far more capable fifth generation J-35A, which was the Air Force version of the J-35, as there was also a carrier-based naval version of the aircraft as its analog. As also, ground attack aircraft would also feature prominently in the Midland-Odessa area. Su-24 strike aircraft, another squadron of Iranian aircraft of this type, had been committed besides their squadron of F-14 fighter aircraft, as also there would be a squadron of the heavy-hitting JH-7 strike aircraft provided by the PLAAF. Due to the inland distance of the Midland-Odessa battle space in particular, all of the coalition aircraft operating in this area would not be using mid-air refueling aircraft such as the Chinese YY-20 or YU-20s, for instance, as they would be able to linger in the airspace due to the short distance inland for roughly an hour to an hour and 15 minutes, as they could conduct hot pit exercises where the aircraft could return to base just for a simple refueling mission and then return back to the battle space. They could conduct these hot pit operations up to 2 times in order to enable them to return to the battle space until American air capabilities were then null and void, as by which point the coalition forces will have essentially nullified the entire USAF, USN, and U.S. Marine Corps aviation capabilities, as in the South Central invasion sector, the Midland-Odessa campaign would essentially be more about economic priorities than much else, although there would be limited military objectives that would need to be achieved, such as destroying local American military and paramilitary forces, and even a sizable, well-armed militia contingent of American forces. For the most part, the viciously brutal Praetorian Guard like People's Armed Police Forces of the 2nd Light Armored Division would essentially be conducting economic capture operations of the massive local oil fields of the Permian Basin, as well as the mines where ferrous metals were mined, as well as also other metals that were vital to Chinese economic interests back home, such as lithium and potash and more, as the energy and mineral slash metal resources were far too important to pass up. This area held enormous economic significance to the overall war planners of the coalition, as the Chinese had electronic warfare capabilities, both in the form of a PLAAF Y9LG electronic warfare slash electronic intelligence aircraft, as well as also the JH-7 Flying Leopards, which had electronic attack capabilities. All of the electronic warfare assets in this battle space were provided by the PLAAF, as there were no ground-based electronic warfare assets to be seen amongst the paramilitary People's Armed Police shock forces. However, the People's Armed Police were a brutally fanatical ground-based fighting force, as they essentially were the other military of China, as China had, it could be said, multiple militaries in the form of all of their paramilitary branches, as well as also their regular standard military forces, as the People's Armed Police was indeed a very heavily armed paramilitary force equipped with heavy weapons, as well as also there being a component of National Production and Construction Corps forces involved in this battle as well, as the 350th Battalion of the National Production and Construction Corps' 7th Division, stationed in Xinjiang, which was now deployed to the United States, would assist even in some of the combat, as they would engage the forces at the local ICE detention facility slash military campsite of the 150th Brigade Engineering Battalion of the larger 155th Armor Brigade Combat Team deployed to this area. They, from their battalion, would contribute 2 of their 3 sapper companies, which essentially were like combat engineer forces from the larger battalion, as the battalion itself had both civil and combat engineer companies within its ranks, as well as a building material quartermaster company, and of course its headquarters and headquarters company over the entire battalion, as the civil engineering companies were also combat trained and armed. They were effectively a non-combat force overall, as their priority would be constructing new facilities upon captured installations, which would include a major objective in the entire operation, which would be the Midland International Air and Spaceport, as multiple objectives throughout this entire battle space were essentially being raced for in rapid succession. Many simultaneous battles were erupting at about the same time, or about 12:30 and onwards, or 30 minutes into the entire invasion, as these battalions had to drive fast for their objectives, many arriving in roughly 30 minutes, as air and artillery and even missile barrages had already begun, as the strategic missile forces of the PLA's Eastern Theater Command, which had contributed the 612th, 613th, and the 616th Strategic Missile Forces brigades to the South Central Invasion Sector, would see just the 612th and 613th contributing to operations occurring in the Midland-Odessa battle space. At the opening of the overall battle, artillery was also pounding many targets located throughout the area, as The ISR capabilities being provided by the PLAAF, as well as also even at the lowest level by the People's Armed Police themselves with their squad level quadcopter assets, all interlocked with satellite to map the battlefield in real time, as the iron grip of the ISR apparatus could effectively see almost every single solitary movement occurring on the battlefield in real time. The feedback loop was completed with the combat data links, which were located both inside of the vehicles of the People's Armed Police as well as also at the tablet level, which was operated by squad level NCOs and up, as the air power was also, again, like the artillery, playing a very prominent role in the operations at the opening, along with missile strikes. The fighter aircraft were conducting combat air patrols in this area, as well as operating in a defensive capacity to protect the orbiting KJ 2000 AWACS aircraft, which, hovering over the Midland-Odessa battlespace, was directing combat which was occurring over 100 miles away, as the beyond visual range capabilities of two other PLAAF fighter squadrons were playing a key role in downing American combat aircraft, which were conducting standard patrols over the area at the time of the tandem anti-satellite and cyber strikes, which also impacted their operations substantially, as it came as an utter shock when all communications were lost, as well as navigation capabilities, as this hindered their ability to respond immensely. As two battalions from the 2nd Brigade of the division, as the 2nd Light Armored Division was comprised of 2 brigades, as well as also its headquarters and headquarters company over the entire division, as well as also a service support company, which even included aviation assets, such as the Z-8 utility helicopters, of which there was a single flying platoon of 5. These were high capacity utility/cargo helicopters and would contribute massively to medivacs as well as logistical supply drops in emergency situations in the battle in the overall operation, as the 2nd Brigade would contribute their forces to the capture of the Midland International Air and Spaceport. One of their armored battalions of light tanks and armored infantry, along with a battalion of light mechanized infantry, would essentially surround the International Air and Spaceport and clear it of all defending forces. On the defending side of the Americans, holding down their positions in the International Air and Spaceport of Midland was the 1st of the 635th, an armored battalion from the 155th Armored Brigade Combat Team, as well as the 877th Quartermaster Company, a reserve company from the local area, which was at the Permian Basin Readiness Center, which was the local Army Reserve installation, which was effectively on the airport grounds. As the assault would see the comprising companies of the armored battalion moving in to both surround and assault the forces on the airport grounds from the south and from the southeast and from the west. The light mechanized infantry battalion would rapidly race with their wheeled vehicles to the north of the International Air and Spaceport of Midland and surround it from that direction, as the PAP forces were exceedingly brutal and fanatical in their operations, as they commonly hoisted the CCP party flag, as they were the true believers in the party. They would fight with immense fanaticism, as well as also disregard standard humanitarian law, as well as also Geneva Conventions, which would add up to them annihilating any and all civilians that managed to get in their way, as well as also in their treatment of EPWs or POWs, prisoners of war, as they would be exceedingly brutal with them as well, as they now, in their two battalions, their light mechanized infantry battalion equipped with the WZ 551 series of vehicles, raced rapidly on the local roads to bypass the International Air and Spaceport just to its east to surround it from the north. The slightly slower armored battalion now moved in from the south, taking local roads through the area in their Type 62G light tanks, as well as also their armored infantry forces with their Type 86G infantry fighting vehicles and Type 63 armored personnel carriers. As they moved through the local area, they too terrorized everything and everyone in their wake, destroying properties as well as people as they moved through the area. By the time the forces were beginning to move in to surround the International Air and Spaceport, as they moved through the local areas, the lights were now beginning to shut off as they moved down the thoroughfares in the area, as they were moving through essentially what was a quasi-industrial slash commercial area en route to the airport grounds, as the illustration or animation, if you will, here is depicting the scene of PAP Type 62G light tanks arriving in the local area as they move down the road, the lights about to go off from the cyber attack taking place at the same time as the anti-satellite strike and also the use of electronic warfare jamming to jam redundant assets such as radio and radar systems, which included portable radars such as multi-mission and air defense radars. The light tanks in this image firing off their coax machine guns, which essentially were beside the main weapon, the 105mm rifled tank gun, at civilians in the area, as well as also the turret gunner firing the even more powerful W85 heavy machine gun, which was a 12.7mm weapon. As you can see, there are people running away as shots were ringing off in the dead of night, as people were running to and fro to avoid a deadly fate from these light tanks. As the light tanks move down the street, they have staggered weapons, the light tank following, facing this way, as they were racing for their objectives. As the battle at the International Air and Spaceport would essentially be an armored battle, the light tanks and their accompanying armored infantry forces with them would be spreading out throughout the area in order to assault the defending forces holding positions on the International Airport grounds, as there would be facing them an American armored force consisting of their own rifle company, which would essentially be their armored infantry equivalent, with their Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, as well as also their M1A2 main battle tanks, which were a deadly threat to the PAP's light tanks. However, these Type 62G light tanks had a trick up their sleeves, which was a range advantage when using anti tank guided missiles fired from their main gun, which could enhance the range of these light tanks to deadly effect. Not only could the People's Armed Police light tanks fire anti tank guided missiles, but they could also fire depleted uranium ammunition, as well as newer and deadlier tungsten sabot ammunition as well, which would tear through an Abrams tank at a range of 1,500 meters or less. Although getting within that range could be difficult, with the tandem anti-satellite cyber strikes and electronic warfare jamming, it made these matters far more simplified, as there were capabilities such as navigation and more which would hinder the effective operation of the M1A2 main battle tanks, as they depended heavily on GPS for their navigation, which now was no longer available, and other information which could essentially hinder their operations, as the electronic warfare jamming jammed some of these sensors aboard the M1A2 tanks as well, as now the Type 62Gs and their accompanying armored infantry were making their way rapidly towards their objectives. They now moved in for the literal and proverbial kill. As these forces got closer to the International Air and Spaceport by 12:30 a.m. or 30 minutes into the overall operation, as we go to the map of the area of first contact in this particular area on the State Highway of 349, the first company of Type 62G light tanks, followed up by a company of armored infantry, were moving along the State Highway 349, about to exit the State Highway to get onto the Route 117, which would take them to Wright Avenue, which Wright Avenue essentially led to the Permian Basin Army Reserve installation, which was being gradually set up as a command post for operations in defense of the international airport grounds, as the Sino-Russian naval drills that had been occurring off of both coasts had prompted the U.S. government to mobilize their forces in response to defend multiple sites throughout the nation considered vital to national security or important enough to defend overall. The forces deployed were spread exceedingly thin, and the regime had to make very difficult choices on what they could defend and what they couldn't, as air defenses for the U.S. Armed Forces were at a premium at this point, as they had depleted their air defenses both in the Middle East, trying to defend against Iranian ballistic missiles and drones, as well as also depleting them in the Great Eastern European proxy conflict. The air defense forces stationed on many U.S. installations had very little in the way of ammunition, and these forces would be annihilated in the opening SEAD operations as it stood. In this particular sector, as there were no air defenses, there were still radar systems that were installed in order to essentially scan the skies and the ground for potential threats. As again, it has to be stated that The regime in the cap city of DC had never once imagined that the largest ever invasion in all human history would befall the land, and therefore had assumed that if the Sino-Russian naval drills went hot, that it would only amount to limited air and perhaps missile strikes from the sea. However, this was not to be the case, as the largest air, land, and sea invasion combined was now unfolding, as the forces in defense of the airport and its surrounding areas again consisted of the 1st of the 635th Armored Battalion minus its Alpha Company, which in this instance was defending the local municipal airport in Odessa, as it had been deployed to the area, as the 106th Brigade Support Battalion was posted at the National Guard installation in Odessa for the logistical resupply operations of the local American forces. The remaining companies, comprising the 1st of the 635th, were positioned all at the International Airport, along with the headquarters and headquarters company over the entire brigade of the 155th Armored Brigade Combat Battalion, which included the full bird colonel, which commanded this entire brigade, as also he was by default in command of all American forces, which included the 877th Quartermaster Battalion, which were the logistical forces for the contingent at the International Airport, just as the 106th were the logistical forces for the Alpha Company themselves and the 150th Brigade Engineering Battalion at their own installation, which was immediately adjacent and connected to the ICE detention facility, which was also a highly coveted objective by the People's Armed Police, as they wanted to convert this into a laogai, or a slave labor camp for forced labor, to essentially economically exploit the area in the colonization and occupation phase to follow the invasion. As now, the International Airport, which was to be converted into a megafob, was now under complete and total attack. Both missile and air strikes would befall the facilities on the periphery of the International Airport, although the International Airport grounds themselves were completely off limits to air and artillery strikes. The surrounding targets that were permitted to be struck were the Permian Basin Army Reserve facility, and also any facilities harboring enemy personnel that were not on the grounds themselves. And as a result, the Permian Basin Army Reserve facility would be struck by DH-10A long-range cruise missiles fired by the bolstered 612th and 613th Strategic Missile Forces brigades in Mexico, as called up reserve battalions manning these systems had essentially made these over-strength brigades. They were now firing cruise missiles into the land, and 2 of which would hit buildings within this compound, along with massive artillery fires coming in from the 2nd Brigade's Artillery Battalion, which consisted of 6 batteries of the 122 millimeter Type 83 towed howitzers, as well as a single battery of 130 millimeter Type 59-I or -1 howitzers, which were slightly more powerful than the smaller caliber 122 millimeter howitzers, with their headquarters and support battery over the entire battalion being their command and logistical elements. These forces now unleashing a torrent of shells on various targets located throughout the area, but initially starting with targets around the International Airport, which were the focus of the majority of their firepower. It would also be JH-7 airstrikes, dropping 8,000 pounds per aircraft on the main building of the Permian Basin reserve facility, which at this point had 50 personnel still within it belonging to the 877th Quartermaster Company, which would also be struck by DF-3A tactical ballistic missiles, which were extremely powerful weapons. As also, besides the cruise and tactical ballistic missile strikes and additional JH-7 strikes on logistical buildings located on this facility, as well as the Hammer multi-mission radar and its affiliated portable building, which was operated by warrant officers, as these facilities would also aid in directing the mortar detachment located at the international airport, dug in on picking targets, as they could conduct counter battery operations using this radar, as well as give warnings for potential drone attacks and other types of attacks. These would be struck by the massive JH-7 airstrikes in conjunction with enormous artillery fires, as a massive artillery barrage would be underway by virtually the entire battalion, save a few batteries, from the 2nd Brigade's artillery forces, its artillery battalion. Initially, first contact would be made by the leading light tank company, moving up 349 and exiting near this medical center, where upon entering Route 117 here and route to Wright Avenue, would engage a platoon from the rifle company from the 1st of the 635th, which was its Charlie company. They would engage a single platoon of Bradleys in this area as the light tanks exited to merge onto 117. As this particular platoon, as the tandem anti-satellite and cyber strikes had taken out essentially the entire grid, as well as effectively removing all ISR and communications capabilities, had seen the battalion commander order a reconnaissance effort in the local area to find out exactly what was going on, and had dispatched a single platoon from Charlie Company, the rifle company, into this area. As they moved from taking Wright Avenue from their positions at the parking area across from the airport terminals where they had been posted, as they were in the covered parking area, they had moved down Wright Avenue and had gotten onto 117, where they would make contact. Because at this point in time, as two companies from the Armored Battalion were moving up 349 and getting onto 117 to move towards the airport from the west, moving eastbound, the rest of the battalion was spreading out between I-20 and also Business 20, or Old 20, which was only approximately a mile between each highway, to spread out to assault the international airport grounds from the south, as well as also sending a company to move in from the southeast to surround it with the companies of the light mechanized infantry battalion, which had raced in from the south, moving to the east of the airport, where they were hooking around to the north of it, as these companies would spread out and essentially with fields of fire cover all possible escape routes from the airport grounds to prevent escape, while the armored forces surrounding the airport from the southeast, south, and east would gradually move in for the literal and proverbial kill, effectively a hammer and anvil maneuver of sorts, as the airport was surrounded. At first contact, as the first light tank company moved in to the area. These would be the first forces from within the attacking armored battalion of PAP troops in the area to engage American forces as they now, merging onto 117, engaged the platoon, which, through their optical equipment, although many of their systems were down, such as radio communications, and they had to use hand and eye based communications to move, as in sight and hearing based communications or runner based communications, in order to coordinate their movements. They, through their optics, could still see ahead of them what was occurring as the People's Armed Police had made it onto the street and were now moving towards them as the engagement was set to begin. It would be a rapid, albeit very brutal engagement from the outset. And the People's Armed Police, to the Americans' credit, would lose a light tank with some KIA and WIAs involved, although the American platoon would be outright annihilated as the battle would get underway. As the PAP light tanks moved into the area and the first platoon, with the first leading light tank, made contact with the Americans, who immediately broke off their vehicles, moving in different directions, trying to maneuver away from the imminent danger of the light tanks, which were far more powerful than they were in their Bradleys. The Bradleys did have one ace up their sleeve. They did have TOW anti-tank guided missile pods on the sides of their turret, which were able to be used, albeit with somewhat difficulty. They would score a kill on the lead People's Armed Police light tank as the first platoon of 5 light tanks now broke off to engage the Americans. The last light tank, going around this building, with the 4th light tank moving to the side of the lead light tank, the 3rd and 2nd light tanks moving off in this direction were now all beginning to open fire, minus this tank, which now started to move around this building to maneuver around, as these Bradleys were moving in their own directions as well. The 2nd and 3rd would maneuver through this parking area of this business, smashing through fencing and crossing the street into another parking area where they would essentially dismount their infantry squads from within the Bradleys to also join the fight. And there were infantrymen armed with AT-4s, as again, anti-tank guided missiles were few and far between, and because so many had been squandered on proxy conflicts in the Middle East and Eastern Europe, the Americans had to ration their anti-tank guided missiles in such a way to where each platoon in the National Guard and Reserves usually only had 1 javelin in these infantry platoons. Therefore, it was very difficult to engage heavy armor of the enemy forces and even their light tanks, as there were very few weapons that were capable of defeating them head on due to this rationing. Although the TOW pods were fully equipped with the TOW missiles, the infantry themselves had very little in the way of effective anti-armor weaponry, although the AT-4 could defeat the Type 62G from the side and from the back. The frontal armor was thicker and also had explosive reactive armor of the FY4 variety, which was incredibly strong ERA armor, and a frontal hit from an AT-4 was not a guaranteed kill of these light tanks, as even the TOW missile could possibly have difficulty with frontal hits. It was the only anti-tank guided missile that had a high probability of a kill against these light tanks, although the Javelin, when using top attack mode, could be effective as well. For the most part, the Americans, again, had very little in the way of anti tank weaponry, as the AT-4 was their primary go to at this point in time, as they were still available in sufficient quantities that could be readily available and utilized against armored forces. As the Bradleys maneuvered into action, they now had begun to be fired on in earnest by, again, the lead light tank. But as the other tanks of the platoon broke off the column to go around these buildings, the follow-up combat platoons of light tanks were now moving into the area as well, as there were 4 combat platoons and the headquarters platoon. The other 2 of 4 combat platoons were spreading out throughout the area, while another would move and form a protective circle around the headquarters platoon vehicles, as the headquarters platoon was equipped with support vehicles and logistical vehicles and was not in shape to engage in combat in any way, shape, or form. The service support company of the entire 2nd People's Armed Police Light Armor Division would have its aviation platoon called upon to conduct medevac operations in this particular engagement, as the Z-8 utility helicopters would be required to come and pick up the KIAs and the severely wounded WIAs from the lead light tank, which would be destroyed in this battle, as there would be a hit from a tow missile from the tow missile pod on the lead Bradley against the lead light tank, destroying it, as the lead light tank, or as the lead Bradley tried to maneuver to get behind this building and dismount its infantry, which would arrive into the building. They would be destroyed by a 105 millimeter high explosive or anti-tank or heat shell, which would rip this Bradley to pieces. As the 2nd Bradley went around and dismounted its infantry squad, and the 3rd did the same around this building, the last Bradley maneuvered somewhat behind this building, which was somewhat safe for the time being, until this light tank had maneuvered around the area, fired a shell at it, and destroyed it, and also wiped out, or destroyed this vehicle, and would begin to wipe out the forces taking cover in this building, as an artillery strike would also be called upon this building as well, as the tanks were now beginning to shell this building, as this squad took cover up against the building, and this Bradley and this Bradley, the first and last, have been destroyed, with one squad going in the building and the other taking position alongside of it. Heavy machine gun fire, as well as coax fire and even frag T-shell fire, wiped this squad out, while the other squad taking cover inside the building was trying to fire AT-4s at these tanks, one of them hitting this tank, but essentially the FY-4 armor defeated it. This tank would now maneuver into this area and continue to shell the building, while this tank moved ahead as well. And this tank now moved here, and were fighting against the infantry moving through the parking lot, taking cover behind trucks and cars, and trying to fire from beneath them and around them. But, of course, the quadcopters flying circuits throughout this area could see each and every movement that was occurring, which would direct all of the tank fire from the main guns, the coax machine guns on the turrets, as well as the turret gunners and their fire as well, shredding these infantrymen to pieces, as artillery now had begun to come in approximately 15 minutes into this engagement, smashing both buildings and destroying these forces, with the light tanks taking out all of the Bradleys, as well as the infantrymen as well that were exposed in the parking lots, as there was very little they could do in the parking lots except for hide behind parked vehicles, such as parked semis, parked cars, and parked trucks, as the fighting in this area was exceedingly heavy but very short-lived. It only lasted 15 minutes, as the tanks rapidly moved through the area and broke off of their column, maneuvering through the area with great effect as they maneuvered around buildings and maneuvered their way to shoot and move at the forces hiding in this building as the artillery began to come in and destroy them, as well as destroying these forces. As the headquarters platoon within the tank company would send a recovery vehicle to pick up the destroyed light tank and tow it back to safety, it would be removed and taken back to the CCP regime property, where it would be examined to see if any repairs could be done or whether it would be chalked up as a total loss. More likely than not, it would be a total loss, as the turret was completely destroyed as the ammunition cooked off and launched the turret off of the vehicle. And essentially, what was left was a smoking hulk of metal, and the entire crew wiped out except for one who was critically wounded and was now flown out from this location by this medical center campus. At the opening of this battle, as two pairs of JH-7 heavy-hitting strike aircraft flew overhead, they were flying en route to pound and annihilate, in conjunction with tactical ballistic and cruise missile strikes, the Permian Basin Readiness Center, as the two pairs would strike different targets on the campus, with the main building being hit by two aircraft, while the other pair would strike these ancillary logistical buildings on the site, as well as also the Hammer multi-mission radar and its command portable building, which was the building wherein the warrant officers and other personnel operated this system and its components, which was now useless with the tandem anti-satellite and cyber strikes, nullifying its capabilities and making it unable to detect anything. However, it would still be a target nonetheless and completely annihilated with everything else. As these vehicles would desperately try to flee the area, some had drivers running into them at the opening of the attack. The Humvees, which were up-armored, which were more or less the command vehicles of this company, the 877th, as well as also LMTV trucks, which were covered trucks, logistical vehicles, and HETs, and also MRAPs, were trying to get out of the parking lot, but to no avail, as massed artillery fires were now coming in and smashing everything and everyone trying to escape, along with airstrikes and missile strikes, as the cruise missiles struck and destroyed buildings, including this one with 10 personnel inside, this one with 50 personnel, and the rest of the personnel running throughout the parking areas in these buildings, these logistical buildings, all being pounded by the air and artillery fires coming in, as each imminent strike marker for the artillery strikes indicates that it was not only one shell, but was likely more, as these exact positions could be hit multiple times by the same howitzer, as the fire missions would shift according to the FDC's instructions, as the FDCs in each firing platoon guided the fire missions, which were calculated with massive aid from the quadcopter, high altitude, and satellite assets, and the real-time AI battlefield data processing system putting together the pre-prepared strike packages, making the artillery capable of conducting fire missions faster and far more efficient than was ever before imaginable or even possible, as the People's Armed Police shelled the area to complete and total oblivion. The leading light tank company and the armored infantry company that was following behind them up 349 before exiting onto 117 would make it towards Wright Avenue, where they would get onto Wright Avenue and head north up Wright Avenue approximately 1 mile, where they would also aid in engaging the forces that were on the Permian Basin Readiness Center at the exact time that these missile strikes and airstrikes were coming in. as the two pairs were only passing over the area on their first passover before they would pass over it again and drop their munitions upon the site. At roughly the same time, the leading light tank company, after quickly reforming and moving the short distance up 117 to Wright Avenue, were moving north and into this area, as this was a building that belonged to the post office as well as another business, and this was the Atmos Energy building here in this quasi industrial slash commercial area adjacent to the airport. The lead company of light tanks was moving up and firing shells into the area at the same time as these attacks were occurring, and would continue up Wright Avenue before the light tanks would continue north on Wright Avenue, and the armored infantry would smash through the fence, as this was the fence line, into the facility, breaking into their three combat companies with their headquarters company sitting behind, whereupon they would fire at any stragglers who tried to return fire, but to no avail, as the heavy firepower from the combination of both the turret machine gunners on the armor personnel carriers with their W-85 heavy machine guns, as well as also the even more powerful infantry fighting vehicles, the Type 86Gs with their very powerful 30-millimeter autocannons, even boasting a short-range but potent HJ-73C ATGM, as well as also a coax 7.62 by 54 millimeter machine gun, would essentially rake up and down the facility, which was now smashed to complete and utter oblivion, and eliminate any remaining personnel that somehow might have survived the missile, artillery, and airstrikes, as many were fleeing for their lives as these assaults opened up. Even as the first flyover occurred of JH-7 aircraft before they pounded the facility, these forces that were outside at the time knew that their days, let alone minutes, were numbered, as they were not long for this world, as they realized that they were about to be hit and most likely would not survive, as the personnel at the guard shack were also hit by artillery strikes before the armored infantry even moved in to mop up. The armored infantry forces, after the mopping up effort, would reform and continue towards the airport, where they would engage the headquarters company elements within the 1st of the 635th, as the headquarters had its personnel both in the terminals and also in the parking areas with the rest of the rifle company, as there was the headquarters platoon and another rifle platoon that were also within the parking area just outside of the airport terminals. There was also a contingent of 350 paramilitary forces helping to defend the terminals, as the fighting for the international airport would be heavy and would go on for several hours, as the initial fighting that occurred at 12:30 to 12:45 had seen the first engagement occur to the general southwest of the airport terminals in the initial area of contact, as this was the freight rail line that ran to the south of Business 20 here. The rest of the armored battalion assaulting the area was now spreading out between I-20 and Business, or Old 20, just to the south of the airport, and they would conduct their attack against the main facilities, as this will be explored in the next video installation of this hypothetical invasion documentary series highlighting fourth generation warfare doctrines through the lens of a Sino-Russian coalition invasion utilizing fourth generation warfare doctrines. As the fighting on the airport grounds would consist of a full-blown armored battle wherein the People's Armed Police light tanks would go toe-to-toe against the American M1A2 Abrams main battle tanks. The People's Armed Police light tanks were part of a team that would involve loitering munitions such as CH-901As with heat warheads, as many had already been launched, as this was only 10 of 48, as the headquarters and support company within the armored battalion had a TEL-like system with 48 tubes for the CH-901A loitering munitions, all 48 of which launched would be entering the battle space with heat warheads to help annihilate the M1 Abrams and Bradley infantry fighting vehicles located throughout the area, as the air power was off limits for use against ground targets on the airport grounds, as the airport was to be taken in as much intact as was possible. Artillery would also be severely limited in this case as well, as again, everything had to be taken completely intact. Therefore, a highly precise surgical solution was needed. In this case, the CH-901A loitering munitions. As the American forces on the international airport grounds would be under heavy assault from this People's Armed Police shock force pushing their way in, they would have to fight with great tenacity to try and even attempt to hold their then current positions. This would be exceedingly difficult, as the People's Armed Police were a highly aggressive, savagely brutal fighting force of fanatics who again were the true believers in the party, and they were ready at a moment's notice to throw themselves at the enemy, even to sacrifice themselves if necessary. They were far more savage than even the PLA, and were far less cautious and less casualty averse. However, that's not to say that they were reckless, but they showed a level of gusto and jingoism that even the PLA didn't possess. And the PLA were very prideful in their nation, leadership, and the party as well. But the People's Armed Police took it to an extreme. They were also completely ruthless against their enemies, as they have had many years of experience in counterinsurgency warfare at home in Xinjiang and Tibet, and had always crushed their enemies with a level of brutality not often seen in the modern world. And now they were bringing this brutality to their enemies, located on the American continent, in this case, in the United States. And certainly the American people had never experienced anything of this sort and would have a rude awakening as their country was being ripped to shreds right beneath their feet. And now, as the People's Armed Police moved in to smash their enemies at the international airport, a vicious armored battle would ensue, whereby the Americans would do their best to hold their positions against this devastating onslaught being brought to bear against them. So they would be showered with anti-tank guided missiles, loitering munitions, tank shells, heavy machine gun and coax machine gun fires, autocannon fires, and more. As the capture of the airport intact would require a level of surgical precision that the People's Armed Police would have to deliver. And they were more than capable of delivering, as they were a very surgical force. These were quasi-elite infantry forces at their heart, but again, they also had forces that operated heavy weapons. In this case, this 2nd Light Armored Division of the People's Armed Police. As most of the PAP forces were reorganized into brigade-sized elements, there were still some divisional elements remaining in the People's Armed Police, and the 2nd Light Armored Division was one of them. And this division was seen as the perfect force to capture this economically vital region of the South Central Invasion sector. More to come in the next video installation as the armored battle to capture the International Air and Spaceport would be underway by 1 a.m. as the assault from the south would commence at this time. As the international airport by then was thoroughly cut off from all directions by the combination, if you will, of light mechanized infantry forces from the committed light mechanized infantry battalion, as well as also the armored battalion from the southeast, south, and east.